All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started here. Welcome everybody to our privacy and accessibility community discussion. For those of you who haven't been here before, our community discussions are intended to be opportunities for the entire community to weigh in on complicated subjects when it comes to XR accessibility. They're put on as a joint venture between XR and the XR Association. And the format is that we usually have a few featured speakers to kind of prime the pump and bring some, expertise to the subject matter. And that'll be the first, 20 to 30 minutes. But then the rest of the time, we're scheduled for 90 minutes a day, is really intended to be public discussion. We want to hear from everybody. This isn't just a presentation where a panel where we have our featured people and then everybody else is supposed to be quiet. This is really a chance for anybody here in the community to bring up the aspects, in this case of privacy, that are important to each of you, and to have a really good discussion about it. And ideally to come away with some best practices or to-dos or takeaways that people can take with them as they go. And we'll be recording this whole talk and publishing our takeaways as well on the Extra Access website after the fact. Pierce, anything you'd want to add to that before we get started?
Um, that was a great overview. I think I just add too that this is the sixth community discussion in the series. We've been holding them in conjunction now for going on 2, 3 years, and because it is intended to be a discussion with subject matter experts in the area and in the field, we would highly encourage and even recommend to turn cameras on and, as Dylan mentioned a little earlier, drop in the chat kind of who you are, where you're from, and what you're learning to get out of today. We'll also be monitoring the chat as well. So if any questions pop up from either of our speakers' initial presentations, feel free to jot the questions down and we will kind of post them or poll the community when the presentations are over and the discussion part begins. We want to hear sort of your experiences in the area and try to understand them. I'm sure not everybody has met everybody on this call, so it'd be nice to make some introductions as well. I think that's the only piece I'd add.
Awesome. And yeah, just to set the scene on the subject. So privacy is obviously a really important subject and extends far beyond just accessibility. But there's a lot of aspects of accessibility that have kind of unique tension between accessibility and privacy. Because there's a lot of technologies, things like facial recognition, things like spatial mapping, captioning, that potentially have huge accessibility benefits, but come at these big risks when it comes to privacy, right? In order to recognize somebody's face or caption their speech, that needs to be recorded. It needs to be fed into an algorithm and then shared back. And especially AR and VR has the opportunity to gather more data than ever before. We really wanted to talk about how we can have our cake and eat it too when it comes to accessibility, right? How we can benefit from these without sacrificing our privacy in the process. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our featured speakers. Alex Ambrose is a policy analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is the world's leading think tank for science and tech policy. Her portfolio covers digital policy, including emerging technologies like AR and VR, biometrics, spatial computing, and the metaverse, in addition to children's online safety, social media, and privacy. And then Brendan David John is an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, specifically computer science. He's the first Native American male to graduate with a doctorate in CS from the University of Florida in 2022, and received his BS and MS from the Rochester Institute of Tech in 2017. His research interests include VR and eye tracking, and he was recently awarded the IEEE VGTC Best VR Dissertation Award in 2025. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Alex. Actually, you've got 10 minutes to kind of prime the pump here for us when it comes to privacy. Take it away.
Great, thank you. I will just take a second to share my presentation with you all. So bear with me as I pull this up here. Great. Well, thank you all again
Oh,
for
Alex,
having
I
me.
think we're seeing your speaker notes here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I told you this happened last time.
Oh yeah,
Let's see here.
classic Zoom.
How about now?
Yeah, now we
Can you
see
see
the whole
okay?
kind of PowerPoint. I think if you start the slideshow from here, it should.
Okay.
The joys of PowerPoint.
So fun. Oops. Let's see here. They're not liking me still. Let me,
I think we still see the frame.
yeah, let me try this again.
Yeah,
Sorry about this, folks.
no worries.
Okay. Let's try. There we go. This should do it. Is that full screen for you now?
Yes,
Yep,
perfect.
perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Sorry about that. This is the joys of working for a technology policy organization when technology fails you. But thank you all for joining. Really happy to be here. Dylan gave a great overview of me, but just to reiterate, I am a policy analyst at ITIF, and my sort of two hats that I juggle are leading our AR/VR portfolio as well as our children's online safety portfolio. So I was sort of thinking about a way that I could combine all of those things for you today and sort of talk about everything and come up with something fun for you all. So wanted to talk about virtual characters and avatars, kind of couching that in a children's experience, but I think it would be important for all users as well. And I know let's see. There we go. I know we talked about ITIF a little bit, but we are a technology policy think tank. We cover basically every technology issue you could think of. We've got someone who works in that space. So just for some background for you all, we are based in the DC area. And to further some more background as well, if you are unfamiliar with what avatars are, they are virtual representations of a user. And so they can mirror a user's physical movements, which we'll get to a bit more later as well. But these can feel even more realistic if there's pieces like gait tracking or haptics, which could be a wearable piece, sort of like maybe a glove that would be able to have the user actually physically in the real world experience something that their avatar is experiencing in the virtual world. And they're a way that users can represent themselves in various ways. So sometimes people want their highly realistic avatar to look exactly like them. And so if you have certain physical characteristics in the real world, you want your avatar to have those exact same characteristics, or they could be completely different from the way that you experience the world. So that could be anything from maybe you want your avatar to be, fluffy unicorn or something like that. It could be an entirely fictional representation of yourself as well. And some of those threats that people might experience in those virtual experiences can range from violence and physical violence and harassment. So someone coming up to you, your avatar user, and maybe hitting or kicking you or following you around, stalking you, as well as maybe impersonation, so pretending to be someone they aren't or pretending to be you and they are not you. And then one of the areas that I find particularly interesting as well are the sort of parasocial relationships, particularly for children, that they can build with these characters, which I'll get to a bit more shortly as well. But from the kind of kids' perspective, I think that they are most interesting to study in this space for kind of three main reasons and why children are particularly at risk with these characters. And I think to start, their cognitive development is one of these really interesting pieces. So from what we know about children and how they interact with these virtual spaces, they need to have a space to play and imagine and create as part of their development. And that's not just virtual spaces, but in general, they need kind of that space to explore. It's how they learn how to socialize, how they learn how to engage with the world around them. But what we also know about children's cognitive development is that they are less able to understand real experiences versus imaginary experiences as compared to adults. So that's why you see sort of my example is always Sesame Street, where you have Elmo is maybe talking to you, or Dora the Explorer asking you questions through the screen, and children think that Dora is really asking them questions in real life, and they could respond to Dora in that way. And so I also use that example because I do think it's interesting that these kind of children's entertainment experiences are sort of pandering to that understanding of how children's development works. And as I sort of mentioned at the top, avatars are a way to try out different types of your personality that maybe you are not comfortable openly displaying in real life. And so these experiences are this sort of safe way to try this out. And so I know one of those ways for people who have speech impediments or communication disorders, being able to have these conversations with avatars are a way for them to learn and practice how to carry conversations, maybe that in ways that they are scared or feel they're not comfortable in real life to have those conversations. It's a way to practice and learn. But then also if there are people who, we even know this for games, for video games, sometimes female users don't feel as comfortable having a female avatar, and so they'll choose other characters or male characters that are presenting in a certain way, so they can have a very different experience in a game than they would if they were to present themselves in a different way. And that also goes with people who have varying physical abilities. So sometimes if you are a wheelchair user, you want your avatar to also have a wheelchair and to be able to experience this virtual world in the same way that you would in the real world. But there's also kind of questions about perpetuating certain misconceptions about people with varying abilities, and maybe the way that they experience these virtual worlds, if they are experiencing harm in the real world, how if they engage with other users, if those experiences are either the same in the virtual world, or maybe they're even exacerbated depending on kind of the anonymity that people have in those spaces as well. So these are all kind of questions. I don't necessarily have answers for you, but these are just sort of the things that we're starting to see in these spaces. Another one that I think is interesting for children in particular are their relationships to brands. So I was talking about Sesame Street or Dora the Explorer. We know that typically, especially as it relates to video games as well, that adults tend to stick with the video games that they play as children when they're adults. So children typically are building brand loyalty to certain games or certain characters, and they bring that with them as they get older. And that could be potentially harmful because children are more susceptible to building parasocial relationships than adults. Not to say that adults don't, but that sort of, again, going back to their cognitive abilities and their cognitive development, we know that they are more susceptible to kind of feeling that one-sided emotional relationship with characters. And so that certainly carries over to virtual characters as well. And like I mentioned before, children have a difficulty understanding the difference between real and imaginary characters. And so if the avatars that they're engaging with are very realistic, that might worsen their ability to tell the difference, that the avatar they're talking to is not a real person, as well as going into if there's certain types of advertising, if a character is telling them to, buy a certain product or have a certain experience or use a certain experience, then they might not be able to understand that this character that they love and that they have this relationship with is selling them a commercial product rather than engaging with them in a natural sort of way. So my last sort of reason I think children are particularly interesting to kind of study in this use case is that their understanding of privacy is very different as a child compared to as an adult. And so we sort of know that children are more likely to share personally identifiable information as compared to adults, but their understanding of privacy grows as they get older. And so as we sort of talk about from a kind of regulatory perspective, treating a 13-year-old in the same as a 16-year-old is very different because their understanding of privacy is different. And then as I was talking about earlier as well, some users want to have anonymity, and I can never say that word, anonymity. And so they want to, you know, have their character different than their physical appearance, maybe different than their name, their real name, but they also want to have highly personalized experiences and be able to have different virtual clothes or skins in these experiences. And my colleague Rachel Franz at Fairplay just put out a great piece about kind of the commercial and economic aspects of children needing, kind of feeling this social pressure to buy these highly personalized kind of outerwear and skins. So would recommend that if you're interested in that. But yeah, those are kind of my three big buckets. And so this kind of leads to some policy questions, which I'm sure we can get to into the discussion. And as I said, I don't necessarily have answers to these questions. I think they're just ways that I'm starting to think about these things as it relates to kind of privacy and accessibility and all of these questions that hopefully we'll get into today. But as I was sort of to just pull some of the ones that I was mentioning before, if a wheelchair user is trying to access a particular virtual building, would that be unlawful discrimination if they can't get in? Would that sort of underlying disability rights laws like ADA, would that apply in these virtual spaces? As well as kind of, like I said, if someone tries to impersonate you or maybe change your own avatar against your will, how might laws treat this alteration of your other user's avatar or someone who creates an avatar in your name and likeness? What are kind of the laws that would govern that? As well as digital influencers. What I was talking about, this sort of commercial aspect of characters interacting with users. Kidfluencers is in social media, at least, a huge thing that I've been looking at, and I can only imagine that that will be an issue in virtual spaces as well, which kidfluencers are just kid influencers, so children who are influencers themselves and create content online. And oftentimes we see that they are quite young, and oftentimes their accounts are supposedly run by parents or managers, but oftentimes they themselves are involved in the creation of this content. So like I said, these are all just kind of questions. Maybe we could spark some conversation later, but just wanted to leave you all with that. And thank you so much for bearing with my technical difficulties. Appreciate you all. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. And I've jotted down some of those questions too, and we can revisit those after the next presentation, which is Brendan. Go ahead, Brendan, take it away.
Sounds good. Let me see if I can hit the technical hurdle here. So let's see if that screen works, and then if I can put my slides up there. Are you seeing the full screen slides?
Yep, got it.
Cool. Okay, and subtitles should come through on that too. But either way, let me play Tetris here. Okay, cool. So yeah, I guess I'll get started. Hopefully I stick to my 10 minutes. Academics love to talk a lot, but we'll go forward. But yeah, I just put in a title there of XR privacy. So a lot of my background comes more from eye tracking and that technology. And I just put this kind of fancy video. It's from a People Labs Neon, a pretty new headset, a pretty new eye tracker we put inside a headset in my lab. And I think I take for granted how kind of creepy some of these videos are just by looking at the eye, let alone the privacy implications, which we'll get to. But some of these things are really, really crazy. So, and then thanks for Dylan, of course, for the earlier introduction. Again, I'm Brendan at Virginia Tech right now, and I'll talk a little bit about my bio on the next slide. So yeah, as Dylan mentioned, I did my BS, MS at RIT, so that's Rochester Institute of Technology. Some of you might also know it's the home for the National Technical Institute of the Deaf as well. I did actually only get a B in my intro to ASL class, but we didn't have plus and minuses, and I was pretty close to an A, I promise, and I'm sticking to that. But it was a really fun experience, I guess, let me say, from that side of things. Went down to University of Florida, did my PhD, and did a lot of work more in the XR eye tracking application space. Here's a little video on the right-hand side of some of the things I did down there, which includes taking a 360 image of a nuclear reactor. So we actually had a training reactor on campus, taking a 360 image, dropping people in for VR training, which was really cool. But one reason I'm showing this is actually to show you what gaze data looks like. So not just that raw eye image inside the headset you saw on the previous slide, but this little green dot that jumps around as they look around, explore, and try to figure out what's next in the sequence of operations. But yes, broadly, I work in privacy preserving eye tracking. I'll talk a little bit about bystander privacy today. And then some of my other work is more in adaptive XR interfaces, as well as secure biometrics in XR settings. So that's just kind of a quick blurb about me from that side of things. Just a quick outline. I'll touch on three kind of broad strokes. A little bit on my dissertation work, which Dylan had mentioned was highlighted by IEEE. It's one of the best dissertations in the VR space in that time frame. Talking more about eye tracking data sets and re-identification. Talk a little bit about my current work, which is looking more at bystander privacy with some of these head-worn systems, and then maybe brainstorming some future directions. I don't have as much concrete info there, but I think that's what I'm trying to get out of today a little bit. Educate myself on kind of this intersection of privacy and XR accessibility, and think about what are these, what are the things to think about with eye tracking technologies very specifically in the future as these ecosystems scale up. So just to give you a little story about what introduced me to privacy and security, I always did eye tracking through my master's at RIT. Didn't really get into privacy security until almost halfway through my PhD. And the reason I did this is I actually had a whole data set, and it's supposed to be anonymized. Like we get approved protocols, we collect this data, we take out people's names, ages, genders, all of the other identifying info, but I still had this image of their eye. And I could look through this data set of images and I could totally tell who was who, whether it was the shape of the eyes that the person I recruited and brought into the lab, or just the iris pattern was starting to stick out to me. So I just kind of threw them into a very open source basic iris matching software, and it worked. So there's the idea that this wasn't really an anonymous data set anymore. So I started to think about it kind of from the data set perspective and just this raw image of the eye that we were using for all these studies. A lot of people share them just openly to develop eye tracking technologies or other systems. And the threat model here is that somebody really could get access to what is essentially your password, right? We stream this off to our headsets, Microsoft, Apple, Magic Leap, they're all using these in headsets for iris authentication. Like you can use them and it's a very efficient way to log into your headset. So I was thinking about this, and if eye trackers give you access to the sensor data, that's not really a good thing, right? Somebody could take this and either spoof your identity or identify you within a data set. So without going too far into this, one of the first thing I did with this space was, what can we do to manipulate these images and kind of have a trade-off here? So here's somebody's eye. I'm saying the sigma equals 0. It's just the untouched image. And basically, I can compute some gaze accuracy, right? This is some utility measure for different applications, and some level of recognition rate. Without reading too far into it, if I collected a stream of data, about 80% or 4 of every 5 images had that person's iris biometric clearly in view. If I crank up, let's say, a blur filter applied to the image, I actually can't do eye tracking anymore. I couldn't even compute the gaze error. But I did completely wipe that person's iris biometric or password out of it, right? The iris is that region just outside the pupil that has all those high frequency features. So to summarize this work, we kind of played with this knob of how much blur can we add? What's our trade-off? Can we still get decent gaze data out of this if we share it? And what is the implication on how often that iris biometric shows up in the data stream? Now, this is some pretty early results. I'm not going to, the numbers, I'd say the numbers matter less for this very small data set, but I will say that there's a larger data set on kind of real world. It's the virtual experience database, if anyone's heard of it for eye tracking. It wasn't AR, VR, but it was head worn, just go about your day on a university campus. And they actually took this recommendation and blurred their data before they released the data set, which was really nice. So that was just kind of scene setting when I started thinking about privacy and security. As I actually got to the dissertation stages of my PhD, I started really formalizing this threat scenario. And we did a lot with gaze data itself. So that little green dot that you saw jumping around that video, I can pull features out of that sequence of that time series data. And that in itself is an identifying feature. It's not quite your fingerprint, it's not your iris pattern, but it's good enough to pull you out of a hat with a certain number of people. Let's say 100, 200 is quite accurate with some of the data sets we looked at. So this is a pretty common model of how can we protect these data sets that we do want to share, we want to support research, or we want to share them with other partners and collaborators, but we don't want people to be re-identified. So there's some pretty famous data set. Some of you might know of this in the privacy space, the Netflix Prize Challenge. So this is back in 2006, I think. Oh, sorry for my dog. This is back in 2006. They took a bunch of Netflix ratings and threw them up without attaching names to them and said, hey, can you predict what other movies someone will like based on other movies that they've rated? And it ended up becoming a privacy problem because some researchers said, hey, this information, and it included some information about dates and when they rated things. They actually paired it with IMDb online. Also, I should note that this is when Netflix would send DVDs to your home, if people remember this time frame. So they actually had the checkout dates, right, of when people had them at their house. They had the ratings and what they thought of the movie. They could actually cross-reference this with IMDb. And in those same time frames, when people are putting up scores, I might choose to rate a few things that I've watched, but not everything. And they were actually able to link real identities to rows in this anonymous challenge data set. And this is pretty interesting. So some years down the line, someone actually sued them as a result of this. It led to a lawsuit because essentially, without going too deep into the lawsuit, there was a mother who was hiding her sexuality from her family and claimed that her viewing patterns and what she was getting through Netflix could have actually outed her if it was a real leak of anonymity in this data set. So this is just kind of scene setting that data set sharing is a re-identification and privacy problem. Gaze data specifically might be in data sets that also have information about your sexual preferences, for example, medical conditions, and just even advertising and personal preferences as well. So just from a set scenario, I took a bunch of gaze data and tried to say, can I re-identify you from this data if I see it in different places? So I'm trying to be kind of high level. I'm happy to answer technical questions, but I just want to hit on these points at a high level that we looked at a bunch of different scenarios from streaming to applications or sharing data sets and developed some mechanisms and solutions to kind of mitigate this risk of re-identification. Some of them had nice math proofs. So my undergrad was computational math at RIT, so it's fun to do a few proofs in my PhD. But actually, we would put some sort of upper bound on. If I share this data, even with advancements in deep learning, I have some mathematical proof over what's the chance of being re-identified. You obviously sacrifice some utility. I think Dylan hinted at having our cake and eating it too in certain settings, but we at least know the bounds of what we're playing with. So that's eye tracking data, the way your eyes move around in that biometric sense. So we can always talk more about that later. What I think is very relevant and something I've been doing since I started at VT is looking more at bystander privacy. So I'm going to play this video. It was going around LinkedIn quite a bit, probably within the year at this point. And maybe some of you have already seen it, but here we have some students that strung together some software. They're wearing those Meta Ray-Ban glasses, and they essentially said, hey, if I'm just recording people's faces, let's take this data pipeline, identify their face, identify their name, and look up information about them with some existing databases. So you can actually see that they do this demo in pretty much near real time. They're doing it to somebody here, and there's another example here out in the public. I think they're just kind of stress testing this thing. So they see somebody, you see in a second. They see somebody, I think they find where they work or something related to what they work, and they use that to actually build a connection with them, right? Introduce themselves, even start talking to them one-on-one. So the video goes on more. I have it stop here, but you can see how this is a huge problem when you're wearing these types of video sensors around. And it's a very relevant threat model. We're wearing these things. The Ray-Bans are around. I'll talk a little bit more about them, but this is something we've been thinking about in my lab here. Again, why does this community care? I think it's already been discussed, but there are technologies based on video camera that are assistive technologies. So if you're familiar with the Meta Ray-Bans, they already have an integration with Be My Eyes. So someone with visual impairments could ask a volunteer to connect to the headset glasses that they're currently wearing and guide them through some sort of action. What's also kind of scary in this space is that folks are finding ways to tamper with and modify the light that actually tells people in the room that your headset's recording at that same time. So these things taken together are very, very concerning as it comes to what is not quite an AR technology, but it's kind of a precursor to that platform. So just for time, I'm not going to go super deep into the system that we built, but I think the short takeaway is we built this idea of something called bystand AR. So if we're giving data to third-party applications, can we scrub faces out of the video stream at the same time and in real time so we don't slow down the headset and its rendering? And the short answer is yes, to some degree. We have to do some performance tricks. And what we ended up doing is actually using eye tracking to kind of give us some sense of implicit consent. So by default, every face I see in the video gets blacked out in 0 pixels. But if I'm having a conversation with you, so we both have joint eye tracking data, or there's some conversation from the microphone between us, I can actually unlock your face in this application. And you all even might have some applications that knowing face data of somebody you trust and are having a conversation with that knows they're being recorded might be beneficial. So we can always go deeper into that, but we kind of did a system style evaluation of this thing. And we basically say, hey, there is a path for privacy enhancing technologies. We specifically leveraged gaze because we didn't want to just completely scrub faces out. There are some applications that want to look at faces nearby, particularly if they've already consented, whatever consent means. This was kind of implicit, but might be aware that they're being tracked. There might be some applications that this builds to. So at a high level, that's that system. We can always discuss further. And that kind of third point I wanted to end with, just kind of for time, is thinking about dark and deceptive patterns. I guess folks here might be somewhat familiar with dark patterns, particularly some of the policy folks. I know Alex has talked about this a little bit in some of our other discussions. We always run into each other right now, it feels like. But there's the idea that the actual interfaces we interact with can kind of trick or manipulate us to make choices. So this could be recurring subscriptions that are really annoying to cancel, even though they're really easy to sign up for, right? You have to call somebody instead of clicking a button. I know this has been a contested issue with a very recent lawsuit that went in, or a very recent law that was trying to go in about the click to cancel. And, we can always discuss that. But here's just an example, right? The big red button says, okay, sure, I will give you this privacy setting to give you extra data. But if you actually want to opt out of it, you have this kind of cut off manage settings, and then you have to go around it that way. Even the wording of got it kind of just indicates that you understood what they're telling you, not that you actually agree to give them this extra data for personalization. Now, this is, of course, a 2D interface and is not really an XR. But again, XR tends to be linked a bit with games and children, right? So Alex hit this on the head and kind of primed that point as well, that the FTC actually has had, I think, 2 lawsuits now with Fortnite related, one more about deceptive patterns in the way that they are charging and kind of getting you to pay them money in ways that are somewhat a trick or a manipulation. So again, I kind of want to go somewhat fast here, but let me just play this video about why I care about eye tracking in this setting. And this is a pretty cool application. It's not my work. It's a paper at UIST. And there's the idea that giving us gaze data lets us actually play around and manipulate the environment and take advantage of your human visual system. Now, in this case, it's kind of an adaptive little game. They're putting together a puzzle on a VR table, and they want to make it slightly easier. So what they do, and again, this was just a short clip of it, is where I'm looking is where I focus my attention. I can actually mess with some things in your periphery, and you're not going to notice. So what they do is they actually change some of the puzzle pieces that they're not looking at. They don't overtly notice the change, but by the time they go back and look over there, hey, I found the piece that I'm looking for. So this is just an example of how I can really manipulate perception if you're sharing gaze data. So let's say you're not even sharing, the floating eye videos are up in the top right corner. I'm not sharing your biometric. Maybe I'm even noising some of the data so I can't re-identify you. I can still manipulate you just by the fact that I have some coarse level of your gaze data. So that's kind of where I've been thinking for future directions. The seed for this work was a workshop paper. It's actually where I first met Dylan in person. Was IEEE VR? What was it, 2024, I think? Yeah, 2024. But I talked a little bit about these ideas. I'm developing them into more of a proposal right now, so I don't have results. But something I think a lot about is what are the different ways that I can guide your gaze attention and manipulate your decisions, but also who's at risk for this. So something I've been thinking about is collecting data from neurodiverse participants, particularly ADHD. I'm very curious about these kind of visual cues and the ways that I guide attention. Does it actually change the way that they make decisions more than a non-neurodiverse user? Are they similar? Or like what are these threat vectors and who is really at risk for these types of manipulation tricks? And I'd be interested to hear maybe what Alex's information gathered about children as well, because some of that might apply in terms of Fortnite and purchasing decisions. And I saw something in the Zoom chat from Allie. Hi, Allie. I know her well as well about Roblox. So I've been thinking a lot about this space, and I'm hoping to get some information about these future directions based on what we talk about today. I'd be really interested to hear if people have other insights. So that's kind of what I have at a very high level. I, of course, have some funding sponsors that make all of this research possible. I'm actually a little bit on hiatus because I'm technically on parental leave, but I run this weekly listserv of privacy and security for XR. So I'm happy to share a link to that in the Zoom chat once my slides are done. And yeah, happy to, kick off this community discussion, see what we get into today. So yeah, that's kind of all I have for the high level. I hope that hit the mark.
Awesome. Thanks, Brendan. So yeah, I think at this point, we can open it up. I would say the first thing I'd love to discuss is how can we trust organizations that say our data and recording will not be stored? I think part of this is kind of from the policy side of things. Part of this, Brendan, a piece of it could be things like your algorithm that could operate at kind of a system level, although we still would need to trust the actual system. But what would we say are the ways that we can have trust that when a organization is saying that we have privacy and saying that our data will not be used to train AIs or be stuck around for years to eventually get leaked and identify us, how can we trust in that? And I'd also encourage people to put their other questions in the chat so we can queue some up as well.
I'm happy to take kind of a first step. Although I won't be necessarily addressing exactly your question, because not necessarily speaking to organizations themselves. You know, I'm sure Brendan could speak more to sort of the technical side of the actual solutions that organizations can start implementing, but at least from a policy perspective of what we can do to kind of protect ourselves. I think one area that I've been looking at, there's a bill sort of floating around right now in Congress called No Fakes, which calls for a federal property right to approve the use of your voice, appearance, or likeness with legal liability for those who distribute or create an unauthorized replica. And so I think something like that is really important to what I was talking about earlier about sort of impersonation. I think with that bill in particular, there's a lot of the conversation is sort of around celebrities and at least with the deep fake conversation, there's been kind of a lot of, I think, focus on celebrities and their likeness being used. But this sort of bill would apply to all of us, and as a way to just sort of have your own kind of rights for the use of your voice and image and likeness, and sort of establishing that right of publicity that right now does not exist. I think Congress is starting to sort of pay attention to these sort of conversations. Earlier this year, Take It Down passed and was signed into law, which it addresses kind of the non-consensual intimate imagery. It's not necessarily kind of the issue we're talking about here, but just to sort of say that I think in terms of building trust, I think there's more that we can do kind of from a legislative perspective. And we can hopefully start sort of integrating these technical, issues like Brendan was suggesting, and sort of try and promote those through policy.
I guess if I had anything to chime in on this, unless, I mean, if audience members feel free to take over too, but from a policy side, one thing we did with the bystander work was we patented this and tried to say, like, does anyone want to just stick this sticker on their headset and say we're doing privacy enhancing things, either just to be more competitive or to kind of signal that? And we didn't really get a lot back. It was kind of like, we could just do this in-house or, an alternate way that isn't exactly the same as your technology. And that, I don't know. I mean, we did some market research more in GDPR EU settings, right? We're again, of course, in the US relative to that law. And there was some, I think the interesting finding that I found is they do have a similar sticker system. I'm not saying it the right way, but they had some idea of this is certified to work okay. And it's usually like, I don't know, automated vehicles that drive around and map out a city or something, right? They don't want to get faces of people nearby or license plates. And they had like a target accuracy of, I want to say 93%. So it didn't have to be perfect, but I think it was a good enough number that when asked about it in certain settings, people felt reasonably safe. And I think that's the farthest I got with trying to link policy there. But that was one setting that at least there was a criterion, right? There was something in mind there that made people feel better. What I can speak about from the eye tracking and, a good example and a bad example side, Meta kind of is the bad example. They have this really interesting white paper document that's like, hey, we know eye tracking is really sensitive, so we're not sharing the raw sensor data, but we're sharing some quantified information about the eye. And they're very vague about what that quantified information is. So if you look at this with my work, it means they're not sharing the image of your eye, which is, the iris, which is really, really bad. So it kind of like looks good. But the vagueness about the gaze data itself, it's still all of the gaze data that I can pull you out of a hat of 200, 300, maybe even more with good deep learning models of data. So they kind of buried the lead to say that, hey, we are somewhat privacy preserving. And I do trust that, they've set up their software that they can't get that actual sensor camera raw data. But what they are sharing is still almost just as bad, but just lesser known. So that's one, I would say, example of like, well, we didn't do nothing here. But if you read deeper into it, it's still pretty invasive and hard to trust from a researcher, but maybe a general user doesn't see that. One really good example is actually Apple. Again, with Apple and privacy, again, they have lots of the data, but they tend not to share it with others, right? So that's a whole different discussion. But for eye tracking, they are the gold standard. They will not share anything about gaze data to just a general developer for their platform. There are some, kind of developer licenses and things that you can access to get information, but they're not going to even share like that green jumping around gaze dot. They're not going to share that with anybody. in terms of unless you have a developer access and you're still working on your application that's not live on somebody's headset. They might share the things that you select, right, in some sequence and order, but that lower level 60 to 90 frames per second data that's really re-identifiable actually isn't accessible at all by their API, to the point where some developers are frustrated by this, and kind of understandably so, right? If I want to have an accessible interface because someone doesn't have as much motor access and they want to do gaze for gestures, gaze, own custom gaze gestures that the app wanted to add, they couldn't do that in the current setup. So they kind of fell on the privacy side of that trade-off in Apple. So those are kind of good and bad examples, I would say, with eye tracking, sample data, that green dot jumping around specifically. That's my own insight. I hope others maybe have some other cool ideas here too. But
yeah, I'm just going to chime in. This is Thomas from Glen Tree. Hi, everyone. Great discussion today. I think I've always had definitely a darkness, even though I've worked my whole career in tech, of like trusting back to the question of, do the companies delete the data that we utilize? And, honestly, I think in the American system, I would think it's like having lawyers educated on the use cases where it's like actually provable that somehow the data was used. I think the canonical example is people are like, my phone's listening to me because I talked about whatever, something I've never talked about, and then all of a sudden I get the ad for it. But every time I hear that discussion, it seems like something that could be designed in a way where it could be provable that someone's violating it. But it would require like technology people with lawyers, I think, making these provable cases, but without there being an audit where there's like massive damages to the companies where they have that risk. I mean, I think it is one of those things that it's so possibly technically difficult to prove that the data was used or stored. But I feel like there is a way to do that. But that's just one of my ideas, is like, how do you get that proof in a way that like a jury or a judge would be like, oh yeah, that's actually happening. That's my
Yeah,
opinion.
I know that this is Dylan. I know there's one or two groups out there. There's one called For Humanity that I'll share here, and I can't speak to you know any results that they've put out, but the model they've put out is interesting. Um, it's basically the idea of auditors, but rather than auditing somebody for their financial data, it's auditing somebody for their kind of user data and how they take in data and how they plug it into AI systems, and conducting audits of kind of AIs and algorithms and autonomous systems. And it would be in the same way that when you hire a CPA, they come in and can kind of audit a company's finances without disclosing that to the government or to other outside parties. They can just audit it and say, based on my word as a CPA, like these finances are okay. It feels like having people that could do that for data and for algorithms that would be given access to deep systems, and be able to verify that the data is being used the way that they say it's being used, is potentially a really powerful piece of the puzzle if we don't just want to let the government go diving into every social media and build up giant database. So I'm curious. I know Bill Curtis Davidson, who's one of the co-founders of XR Access, has been working with them a bit. I'm curious if anybody else has seen schemes like that or other kind of verification methods.
I haven't seen too many verification methods like that. And while I think building trust from an enterprise side is important for these types of conversations, I'm curious what the community thinks about general user knowledge and information. Eye tracking is foundational in letting most VR apps run, and as outlined here, there's some pretty big privacy risks. So, a new user seeing a presentation like this and understanding what their eye tracking data is helpful for, but also the inherent risks involved would be really helpful. Of course, that scope cannot happen. It'd be just too big. So I'm wondering if there's a solution there from like a user side, to say something like, a beefed up terms and conditions. Would that be helpful? Is letting users know that their privacy, like, where their data is supposed to go and kind of what their options are to, ask the companies to remove it, sort of bleeds in a little bit to the trust from an enterprise side. I mean, yeah, will like a terms and conditions thing be helpful? I mean, how can we build user knowledge around some of these technical discussions, or should we?
That's a really great question. And you just sort of sparked in me. One of the things that we've written about at ITIF is usability, and how if you have experiences that are easy for users to use, then you can sort of automatically bake in privacy there, because people can just better understand the way that the technology works. And so another, sidebar too to that as well, one of the things we think about are, at least for me in my work, are parental controls. And I think a lot of the feedback we get is that parents either are using them and children are just very crafty and they're able to get around parental controls very easily, or the parental controls are so different depending on the platform and potentially hard to navigate depending on which experience you're using. And so those are kind of those two policy challenges, I think, of ensuring that the right kind of controls are in place and parents are familiar with how to use them, but also making sure that the experience is not completely kind of lost on the child or on the user, and that you're not taking away their ability to use the experience by making it such a kind of convoluted process. So I think, circling back to your original question, I think usability is a piece that, in particular for standards, one of the things we've also advocated for is for NIST to improve their kind of guidelines and standards in this space, particularly as it relates to kind of identity verification and authentication, and making sure that those are all sort of secure in their immersive experiences and immersive platforms, with the understanding that kind of users may want to have a digital presence that's separate from their real life identity, which is something that NIST has kind of identified already in their digital identity guidelines, but are just things that could be better integrated for immersive platforms.
I'm curious if this is like a combination of your two presentations, but is there any way with the iris to like determine the age, or like have any prevention of like, I guess using biometrics to enforce some safety? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, iris not as much, but I've seen this in eye movements. Like our eyes are muscles that we have lots of data on from ophthalmologists, right? So there definitely are some clear links between, and those age ranges actually are the age ranges you might care about. Like is 13 or 14, I think the meta cutoff right now. You're supposed to be at least 14 to use the meta ecosystem, right? I do think if you had some eye tracking data running, you could probably say these are very, underdeveloped eyes. I forget the exact ranges, but I've seen hints from just more of a research side that could be operationalized in some way. Alex, I think I saw you unmute there if you have some thoughts too, but yeah.
No, you took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly one of the things that we've been thinking about. I want to say it's Apple who has been using that, to what Brendan was talking about as well. I don't quote me. I'm pretty sure it's Apple, but yes, as a way to do age verification, particularly because at least for headsets right now, we at ITIF define them as sort of, they're in the family computer stage. So typically if a household has a device, they have one, and adults are using it and children are using it. And so it's a way for children to maybe, like I was saying, get kind of, they use their parents' account and they can access different experiences that would otherwise be not age appropriate. And so kind of like Brendan was saying, if there's a way to use kind of maybe not necessarily iris recognition in and of itself, but different kind of data like eye gaze tracking and things like that, that could, the platform would then be able to realize that the user is not the adult, it's the child, and then kind of switch to the child account. So yeah, it's definitely one of those kind of age verification questions that I think and the age verification conversation, we could do a whole other hour of chat about that, and I will spare you all from that. But I think in terms of privacy, there's always those trade-offs of every solution that there is for age verification, at least right now, there's always kind of a trade-off there. But that sort of technology could be one where it's, to what I was saying before too, has that usability. And so it doesn't necessarily hinder the user experience as much, but it's a way to keep kind of children safe.
And Alex,
Can I
we have a.
say one thing on this?
Oh, John, go ahead.
Yeah, just there. I know as researchers, we always love to go for things that are more complicated, but like if you have a number of members of the household on a device, they probably all have average heights that are different in some way, that especially children, that could be detected before going to eye gaze if you have a floor level type measurement. Anyways, just a thought.
And gait tracking too.
Yeah, no, I'm just imagining some kid getting up on a chair and like holding the thing up to be like, yeah, I'm this height. Don't worry about it. No, definitely in combination ways to do that. Yeah, or you could have an 11-year-old that's taller than you are. So we had a question here from Asif from CSU about what can be done to improve the policies for XR, and specifically, how can we present privacy policies in a way that's not so complicated or convoluted to help users raise awareness? Is there room for improvement when writing the policies? Now, Alex, I know you were just talking about kind of the usability of policy. Uh, what can we do there in terms of things like simple language or other types of ways to just make it easier for people to understand what the rules are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, I think Brendan talked about GDPR. That was kind of one of the things at ITIF we've sort of noticed with policies that are trying to mimic that sort of experience is, it set this sort of standard for cookies online. And from what we've gathered from users, everyone just hits accept because no one wants to actually read all of the privacy policies, or they don't want to hinder their experience online. If you're going to a site and you just want to go on the site, you're going to hit accept because you just don't want to bother with going through all of that stuff. And so from a policy perspective, we sort of say, anything like that, there are a lot of calls for, at least in the social media space right now, although it could kind of be a predictor for some of these policies for XR, but at least the conversations around social media right now are sort of warning labels or having labels for things like the experience you're using right now is generated by AI, it's not a real human. Those sort of disclaimers. What our research has shown is that typically people don't care. They don't care that they're not talking to a real human. They don't care that they're getting this warning label. They just want to continue using the experience. And so I think that understanding can play a role in how we start developing these policies of making sure that the ways in which we're presenting this information does not totally impede on people's ability to access the experience. And so what I think Brendan was talking about it as well, of just having kind of very clear, like, got it, understood, really basic language and presenting it in a very simple way, in a quick way of just being able to start the experience are things that users typically want. And I think it was Pierce talking about it as well from a policy perspective. I think ensuring that, on the policy back end, the definitions and the way that we preserve privacy on the policy side will ensure that then the experiences are sort of safe and privacy protective out of the gate. And so users themselves are can have that assurance that the experience they're using has already been, there's kind of a regulatory thoroughfare before they actually start using the experience. So those are kind of all of like the policy questions and then policy considerations that we're trying to think through. That it is a good question.
Yeah, and while you were talking, I thought of the disclosure labels on cigarettes, where they went from just saying like this, may cause cancer, to having like pictures of really grody lungs and things. And I just had this vision of you go on a website and if there's cookies, there's just this like creepy pair of eyeballs just watching you the whole time, and that maybe could make people think twice.
Yeah, that segues really nicely. So we have this thing called visceral notice. It's not something I came up with. Ryan Callow at UW, and then Evan Selinger, who's kind of more a philosopher I collaborate with, has talked about, a little bit of their point is that notice and consent is part of the problem, right? So would even changing the words in the pop-up that, you hit I agree to even do anything. But there's that idea that like this idea of a visceral sense that literally one of our interfaces, if you follow this link, is a pair of eyeballs floating in the top right corner that does exactly what your eyes do. And it basically is that constant reminder that, hey, oh, my eyes actually are being tracked. And it's done things like, draw a little trace in front of you where your eyes are looking, which of course trades off with usability, like Alex mentions. And we pitched some of this work to her working group there at ITIF too, where it's like, it is kind of annoying, but it reminds me of these subconscious things that my gaze data is revealing about me. And again, I work a lot on eye gaze, so that's why I talk about that sensor. But it really caused people to say, like, they're strolling through a VR art gallery. They stopped looking at the nude imagery because it's just random art pieces kind of filled in to see what people look at. If they had that sense of being watched, they actually changed their subtle behaviors in a way that responded to those indicators. So I think there's some really interesting directions. Again, I put the URL in the chat there. We haven't quite got to the point where that's an actionable policy thing, but we're just from a user experience side trying to understand that, at least as HCI researchers at this stage. And there is some promise there. I think the only thing that was interesting is that we did a more recent study where we actually added this privacy noise and said, hey, here's your noisy data. Do you feel safer? And they said yes. But at the end of the study, they still said I'd be fine sharing the raw data. So I think we need to explore a little bit more about, like, okay, here's what they're going to actually do with the data, not just here's what the data looks like, situated within the VR spatial environment. What are people going to actually do with the data that you can't draw the conclusion yourself on necessarily, because you might just be more of a general user that doesn't understand everything the AI models that they're feeding can do with the data. So that's kind of where we are with that research thrust. I just want to pitch that because that idea of visceral notice is exactly what you're hitting on there, Dylan, which is really fun.
Awesome. We had oh, go ahead.
I was going to pitch another question. If there's another one in the chat, that can certainly take precedent.
Well, sure. Why don't we do one more from chat and we can do yours. The next one that we had in chat was from Susan Hirsch, saying, does anyone know anything about the data Apple or other companies collect when using voice recognition for navigation, like voice control or dictation? It's hard to tell from the documentation exactly what data is sent to them and when, and what are the risks of that data being out there given AI voice replication?
So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
So is the question about kind of Apple specifically, the like Apple specific policy, or more kind of general like voice recognition data?
Said Apple or other companies in parentheses. So take your pick.
Okay, yeah. Again, I don't necessarily want to speak to like Apple specifically per se, but I think just in general, speaking about voice recognition, again, that's kind of one of those areas where I think we're ripe for policy. And again, to what I think it was Pierce who was talking about before, like there's in the latest version of the updated COPPA rule, which COPPA is kind of our, at least right now, the sort of, I don't want to say gold standard, but the law that we have is sort of our baseline for kind of protecting children's privacy online right now. And this update has sort of included their definition of personal information to include things like voice recognition and including that as a type of sensitive personal information. And so I think that's one of those areas that we should try and encourage, is to make sure that the definitions that we're using to talk about this kind of personally identifiable information is inclusive of all of the ways that could include things like voice recognition. And I think another area that's ripe for inclusion as well is there's only 4 states, I believe, so far that have kind of included neural data as well to be types of sensitive personal information, California being one of them. But again, it's still sort of a policy question, but I think just sort of better having clearer definitions for what constitutes sensitive personal data is really important. And in particular, knowing that there are high risk levels of data that's like health data or this biometric data we're talking about, any data for children under 13, or I think it was Dylan who was talking as well about precise kind of geolocation information as well. All of these things, we should sort of ensure that our definitions are inclusive of all of those different use cases.
Absolutely. And one thing I wanted to add on to that is, I know for the Vision Pro, and I think for the HoloLens, Microsoft HoloLens as well, before that went kaput, there were a lot of promises about like this processing is done on device, right? There is, it's not going up to the cloud, it's done offline. And I was curious if people on the call had kind of an understanding of right now of what are the limits of what can be done on device and what you need the performance of cloud computing in order to do. We're talking about basic, captioning or like facial recognition, looking for particular faces. I don't have a clear understanding of where that like on-device performance level is at right now. That where's the cutoff of you really need to send it to the cloud in order to get performative work.
That's changing rapidly, but more importantly, all of the companies are disincentivized to tell you what is possible to do locally because they need those large data sets to do their work.
Yeah.
I'm also seeing a growing trend now to, while the data is not going to the cloud, it's the processing is being done on a paired phone. So the headset itself can be a little lighter and a little more agile, but the processing itself is happening on the phone, which I'd be curious to hear if this is like true or not. But I imagine that raises the bar a little bit for the amount of processing that can happen because the phone is a more powerful unit than the headset is. So I imagine that raises the bar for, or like increases the threshold for on-device processing without having to kick it to the cloud. Again, I don't know if that's factual, just kind of it might be.
Yeah, actually, I'm doing an experiment where I'm doing transcription on a paired phone and then using a local GPT to handle some API calls. It's definitely possible with phones from the last year. Google has a set of embedded models, Gemma version specifically for their devices that handle vision and text pretty well as far as large language models go.
Interesting. I'm curious too, from from an accessibility or disability perspective. I suppose worry that a reliance on accessibility features almost leaves that population more vulnerable to privacy issues. When we think about, it's been brought up before. Alex brought up gait, and we've talked about eye tracking. Being able to match biomarkers to an individual's identity is bad enough. But then when you add in a sort of like, I don't know if companies are doing this, but a flag that this person is relying on accessibility technologies, what does that mean for the accessibility community? Like, what are the outcomes, good or bad, that could happen from, maybe a reliance on accessibility technologies or just a marker that's, signifying that this person fits into this criteria?
That's a really, really interesting question. And as it relates to avatars, that was something too that again, it's more of a question than I have an answer for. But if a user is a child, I think I know of this, at least for Meta's Horizon Worlds. Presenting as a child makes you a target for other adult characters on the experience. And if you look like a child, they might, you become sort of a marker for potentially predatory, experiences. So the way that you present yourself could be, like you were saying, Pierce, maybe, for good or for bad, could be a flag. You reminded me of, actually my first piece that I wrote for ITIF was about a digital ID that Oklahoma was trying to roll out, and they, to register to have your digital ID, it used kind of an image of a face on the screen, and you had to match your face line it up with the face on the screen. But there was no auditory cues, and so for people who were low vision or blind, they had no way of knowing if their face was in the screen because there was no kind of recognition of move your face to the left, move your face to the right, line it up with this. And so ultimately Oklahoma scrapped the project entirely which would not really be the solution that we would hope for. We hope that you would come up with an accessible solution out of the gate, so you didn't have to have this experience at all. But I think to your point as well, Pierce, it's so important to include kind of those voices, the differing voices in the start of making these technologies, especially because from what we know with, like we were talking about before with Dylan, with captioning and I mean, the list goes on of all these different technologies that we've used, starting them from an accessibility standpoint. Typically, users who don't need them embrace them because having accessible features kind of makes better usable experiences for everyone. And so, yeah, just kind of making sure that these experiences are accessible from the start, I think is really important. Including those voices from the beginning is essential.
I think this is the plus one to that. I put your ACM paper that should be open access, so everyone should be able to read it there. There's something Dylan even asked me about, I think, a few years ago. It's like, are there assumptions in the eye tracker that someone with certain vision conditions can't even use them, like to that ending point of designing that? And that is the case. It's from my old PhD lab after I graduated. So just showing that in there, that even that barrier is still almost there, that some of the technologies aren't supporting folks that actually want to use them for accessibility, right? Because gaze gestures have promise for certain conditions, but here's what's happening. So I just wanted to drop that as a short plus one to that. To
Oh
Alex's
yeah,
point.
no. When I was trying to use the Microsoft HoloLens as a vision assistant device, we kept trying to bring in people, especially those with central vision loss, who were used to looking at things out of the corners of their eye, and it absolutely did not work with the eye calibration. And yet the HoloLens insisted on running eye calibration every time somebody put on the headset. It was a giant pain. One thing I wanted to make sure we talked about here is consent in terms of consent of other people being recorded, right? So when we're talking about things like, let's say I'm deaf and I'm wearing some of these captioning glasses, right? Those are capturing people around me and recording that speech and turning it into captions, right? And that could be happening on device. It could be happening in the cloud. What should the requirements be around consent of those people who are having their voices transcribed, right? Is it the type of thing where you have to open up every conversation with, hi, I'm Dylan, and by the way, my glasses are transcribing this conversation? Is it something where only when they, if you start to talk about something that might be considered private, or if you're in a private space as opposed to a public space? I don't know how this relates to like hot mic situations as well, but I'd love to hear people's opinions on that. And then also as it applies again to facial recognition, right? If that's again a valuable tool, but how do we make sure it's that people can consent to have that technology used around them?
Hi, Bren.
Oh no, I was just saying I wish I had some of these answers. I mean, it reminds me of like the otter.ai and things that show up in the Zoom calls, right? Like there's someone at VTU, Kyra, who just always starts every meeting by like saying, "Let's stop otter AI," even if it's not turned on, because they just like that happens all the time in these types of meetings. I wish I had better answers. Go ahead, Alex. I just chiming in with that point.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. And actually, in your presentation, the piece about like buying stickers to cover the lights. I want to say it's Meta. Again, I don't quote me, but there is an organization who is working on if someone tampers with that light or with the camera and tries to cover it, that sends a flag to the company that that user has tampered with that ability. And I think too, it is just a broader question. I think we're still kind of socioculturally trying to grapple with the fact that we haven't fully even come to terms with the fact that you could be recorded all the time, even with cell phones. You go out in public and you could be recorded via cell phones. Like to say nothing of glasses. And I think as adoption of those glasses grows, there's certainly a lot of companies who are really pushing towards the AR glasses and kind of growing that space. As consumer adoption grows, I think we'll have to sort of grapple with yeah, with that. And I think those sort of tampering, flags, I don't necessarily know what the like technical implications of that are, but from at least a policy perspective, those sort of things I think make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I'll have to look
definitely.
into those flags. Go ahead.
I was gonna say it's definitely wild to see the difference between a few years ago when Google Glass first came out and people were getting called glass holes because everybody thought they were going to be recording everything, and now fast forward what 5 or 10 years, like Snapchat AR, and it's just, oh cool, okay, I guess I'm going to be on TikTok, whatever. Um, yeah, does the values change?
Yeah, because I think social aspect is really key here. That's my takeaway, right? Initial phones, like, it would be very scary, but like, oh, like, okay, that person's just taking a photo. Like, you might then go away, but the glasses change it. And I wear I have a pair of the Meta Ray Bans kind of for research purposes, and I wear it around to see if people respond to it. And they haven't really, but there are a few people who do notice it. And I guess that's one reason, I know it's not linked to policy, it's more of a vacuum, but the idea of social, kind of consent where it's like, okay, I'm having a conversation with you for a certain period of time. Maybe I'm okay with you sensing whether it's voice or even my face, right, about me. But I think we don't have good quantified, like if we hit this target or people start to feel comfortable because it is like a social thing that's very hard to measure. So I wish we had better insights, at least as technical side, to target these things. I wish we had better tools that link them right to policy, but that's one of the struggles here is linking that technology and policy pieces. We can come up with all of these different special interfaces that make it make sense. Like, oh, your phone gets the notification if you're near somebody who's recording with the Ray-Bans, but like by the time you instrument that thing, are the assumptions different, or do people even want it that way? It's not quite clear yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I've gotten to the point too of like already just presuming that it goes that way, and then you go into the risk of like AI being able to generate something so realistic and impersonate people that it almost seems like a good thing that if everyone's recording, thinking about like court case or something, but literally that, okay, if 3 or 4 people's recordings match up to this event actually happening versus there's only this one recording, at some point you would say, well, that recording's not real if it was only coming from like a solitary recording because, well, they could have generated that with AI. That's not really me. So I guess it is just kind of wild, but I feel like for right now, at least the public-private space would be what I wish there was a way more like automatically. I think people, have talked about like if they're blind and needing to go into the bathroom to like use the Be My Eyes or something to navigate to the bathroom is a great use case. And then that goes into, for me, socially, I would be like okay with that as long as the stuff is deleted and basically special license for that. But it'll be a whole conversation there. And I do think generally people in a private space would presume you would have that conversation with them, and maybe in a public space, yeah, if you don't ask the person, yeah, you just have to presume someone's wearing glasses at this point, maybe recording. But yeah,
Yeah,
it is wild.
that reminds me of I worked in Emily Cooper's lab at the Berkeley School of Optometry for a while, and one of the projects that
There's no
she had
sound
going.
perfect. Yes.
Oh,
No.
am I not? You
I
guys
don't
hear?
think there's anything to feel bad about. I think it is for us to be conscientious because we are so close to it. But
Oh, sorry, Amanda, are you speaking to the group
yeah,
or have a
yeah.
hot mic?
No, you're good. It's XR
I
access.
think that's a hot mic. I'm gonna go ahead and mute Amanda. So as I was saying, Emily Cooper's lab, she was working on another kind of technological approach, which was that, let's say, yeah, you're a blind person, you're trying to identify in a bathroom where the urinals are, ideally without getting 4K high def footage of somebody's dick, right? Um, and she was working specifically on the challenge of how low resolution can we get a camera and still get useful information about the environment. And so, like, purposefully having a camera feed that's only like 64 pixels by 64 pixels, and seeing if we can at least tease enough data from that to help identify here's the toilet, here's the sink, here's the door, which I thought was a really interesting approach. So there's certainly other kind of technological solutions like that. That's, you don't have to worry about this data as much because we're specifically not gathering data or not sharing data that can be used for ill. So we've got about 10 minutes left here. I know there are one or two more questions in chat. Does anybody have any real kind of burning inquiries or things we want to close out the discussion with? Otherwise, I think there was one other one I had in the back pocket here. Oh, yeah, I was curious about when it comes to 3D mapping. So this is one of those spaces that is, I think, again, kind of very new, right? But we've started to see devices that specifically build up maps of your environment, right? When Meta, you put on the Meta headset, it kind of scans your environment to figure out where your boundaries should be. Or same for the HoloLens, as you're walking around, it will generate this 3D scan of the room you're in. And now a lot of the work I was doing at Berkeley was focused on how do we take that data and turn it into useful information for people who are blind or low vision, right? To be able to guide somebody through a space or identify obstacles. And I was curious if people have heard, have an understanding of where does 3D data like that land in terms of kind of sensitive information, personally identifiable information, particularly in the context of having easy ways to share that. Because I could see a future where, let's say I'm wearing some AR glasses, I walk into a public space like an airport or university, and it kind of beams in, here's the 3D map of our space. And if you want to get to room 104, then follow this path. Um, and I could see that even being the case of like, for me, let's say I have in my house, I have a 3D map of my house. When my friend comes over who's blind and is wearing these glasses, I want to give them access to that map. Um, but what happens if it's like a government facility or a bank vault or things where like having that, it could be helpful for navigation, but also could represent a real risk. I'm very curious where that type of data, how it's treated today, and if that's been changing.
Well, and just to add on to that as well, other considerations too of, if you're using glasses and you have a map going, if you're driving, is that allowed, versus just walking? Or I think another one of the considerations too, to build off of your list, Dylan, of if there's some sort of maybe someone has been stalked and the data of their house and the layout of their house gets leaked, or for victims of domestic abuse, if they move to a different house and then now that data is breached, that now their abuser has a map of their new house or maybe their workplace or anything like that. So it's not answering a question, but it's just adding on to some of those policy considerations of what to do with that data, because it could be exactly what you said. It's one of those instances where the technology has clear use for accessibility, but also clear kind of potentials for privacy violations as well.
Right, because I know, websites like Zillow will store floor plans of many, many houses. And so if you could, catch that could suddenly be PII. Okay, seems like that may be still unexplored territory here. So
I think
I'll
there's
keep our
one.
eyes
Yeah,
peeled.
I don't know much here. There's one headset. I can't think of it. It has like a visor that flips down. If I find the name, I'll look up for it after I say this. But they sell like a special, version for people who work on those, whether it's like a military site or government site. They'll actually sell a version of their hardware that like has like a kill switch for the cameras and everything else, just to turn those sensors off. I mean, that's obviously much more drastic than don't scan this room or don't share this room file. But I know people are trying to get those technologies in those spaces, so people are trying to find security. That's almost more of a security access problem, but I've not seen it for room scanning. That's a really interesting point.
Right. Well, and even like there's questions around how do we mark whether a space is public or private, right? Like, is there a way for the device to know as you cross some threshold, like you have exited private space, please turn off your sensors? Yeah, some challenges there. Brave new world.
Yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's a lot more questions than answers. But I think it's really important that we even have these spaces to kind of talk through all of these use cases, because you know, there are instances of this technology, to what this whole discussion has been, where you know, there's one purpose that it was designed for, and then there are all these other potential uses that the design might not have been thinking of originally. And so it's great to have this kind of space to talk through all of these different use cases and potentials, because this is how we kind of can bring that conversation to policymakers and actually get some regulation and some rules of the road in place. So I'm grateful to hear all of your ideas. This is really helpful to me.
Yeah, and I'll put a quick shout out to the Metaverse Standards Forum. So we have a group, so this is a big kind of collaboration of different organizations working on XR and kind of the standards related to them. We have specifically a accessibility working group that we meet every other Tuesday. I'm trying to type and speak at the same time here. And we've been kind of trying to create accessibility standards, but I know there are also, in terms of the active domain groups, I'm certain there's at least one or two on privacy as well. Yeah, privacy, cybersecurity, and identity. So you can access that from the link I just shared if you just go to the groups and projects. I would really encourage people, if this is stuff that is important to you, if it matters, if you have the time, to try to get involved in some of these conversations, and hopefully we'll find a way to turn these from just kind of conversations into actual standards. I know we're hoping to work with the W3C. You know, we've already talked with some of their like accessible platform architectures groups, such that once we have our big list of standards criteria, hopefully they can turn that into a proper standard. And then when, you know, somebody eventually sues about this, as is inevitable, we'll have something to work off of. Right, because I think trying to interpret all of the questions of today based on the legal frameworks of yesterday is always a recipe for a mess. So encourage folks to check that out. Obviously, we have our XR Access Slack that I'll put in the chat as well, that people are welcome to use. Yeah, any closing words from anybody before we wrap up for today? All right. Well, in that case, I want to thank everybody for coming. I think this has been a brilliant conversation. I definitely have, if not a ton more answers, at least a ton more questions floating around in my head. So I think we'll close it here. We'll be posting the video and chat from today to our XR Access events page in the next few days. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming and chatting and having this great conversation with us.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you,
for
everyone.
having us. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.